Okay, well, thank you all so much for coming. The Centre for Geopolitics has covered many topics over the last few years, and this is one of our first steps into a new research program on the UK Union, which was conceived over the last year or so, and we're now getting there. We had a lecture in the autumn term by Professor Murray Pittock of Glasgow, and now we are starting a couple of events this term. There'll be more in the next academic year that we're terming Witness to the Union. And our purpose here really is to invite people who've been central to the recent history of the UK Union in all its forms, down to Cambridge, to have a conversation and to explore their own thoughts, their own experiences of politics and the UK Union, and then get into a conversation here. And really try and get to the heart of some of the deeper questions about how the Union has evolved over the last 20 years and where it might go. And I can think of no better way of starting it than with a former First Minister and a former First Minister of Northern Ireland. Baroness Foster was elected in 2003 as an MLA for the UUP before joining the DUP in 2004. She was then Minister for the Environment, for Trade and Investment, and then Finance in subsequent Stormont assemblies before becoming First Minister of Northern Ireland from 2016 to 2017, and then again from 2020 to 2021. She was appointed a life peer in the House of Lords in 2022. Baroness Foster, thank you so much for coming. It's great to have you, and it's great to have this conversation. I'm also delighted to welcome Professor Eugenio Biagini, who is known to most of you, I'm sure, as a professor of British and Irish history here at Cambridge, who's going to be following in with some of the conversation as well. And I'll hand things over to the two of you in a moment. But I have one question I'd like to begin with and to kick things off into a wider conversation about unionism in Northern Ireland, which is that your own first steps in politics were with the UUP. You then move across to the DUP, and in all of those experiences, what is central is the response to the Good Friday Agreement. So perhaps to begin with, we could talk about, or you could say a bit about your own reaction to the Good Friday Agreement and how that shaped and led to your positions early on in your political career.
Okay, Hugo, thank you so much, and it's lovely to be here in Cambridge to discuss and be a witness to the Union as described. Well, of course, we've just passed the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Agreement, so there's been a lot of reflection on what happened 25 years ago. I thought Mark Durkan summed it up quite well when he said it was a bit like nostalgia bumping into amnesia on the way to obscurity. So a lot of people have different memories of what happened back in 1998. But I think we need to go back further than 1998 to get up to 1998. Don't worry, I'm not going to go back 800 years. What happened actually on the run-up to that was initiatives like the framework documents from John Major. Of course, you could go back further and talk about Sunningdale and talk about the Belfast Agreement as well, or not the Belfast Agreement, the Anglo-Irish Agreement back in 1985. But I think things really started to change with the first IRA ceasefire, and then people started to think, was there an opportunity to have discussions? Those discussions started to take place. I was the election agent, a very young election agent of only 25 in 1996 for the Forum elections at that time, when they brought everybody into a forum for political dialogue. And that was really the start of people starting to talk to each other in a meaningful way. And then after 1997, we had a new Prime Minister in Tony Blair and a new Taoiseach in Bertie Ahern. And they both had been speaking whilst they were in opposition about the need to try and find solutions to what was happening in Northern Ireland. And then in earnest in the autumn of 1997, the talks began. And as you rightly say, I was in the Ulster Unionist Party at that time. And coming up to Easter in 1998, I think, and I am very much on record as saying that David Trimble, who was leader of the Ulster Unionist Party at that time, very much an academic, a respected academic, had got the situation right in terms of the constitutional position of Northern Ireland. He had an agreement that there would be a referendum on Articles 2 and 3 of the Republic's constitution, which of course laid claim to Northern Ireland. And in return, there would be a statement that Northern Ireland would be part of the United Kingdom for as long as the people of Northern Ireland decided that they wanted it to be part of the United Kingdom. So that constitutional clarity was part of the Belfast Agreement. I think what David missed was the fact that in terms of other issues, as I sometimes call them, strand 4 issues, there were issues there of an emotional nature, of a nature of justice that caused real difficulties. I found it very morally objectionable that people who had committed some of the most heinous crimes in Northern Ireland were released from prison as a result of the Belfast Agreement. And you might say, well, you know, you have to move forward, you have to look to the future, forget about the past. But actually, that allowing people out of prison and that moral obfuscation that took place at that time continues to cause problems for Northern Ireland today. And we still have those legacy issues to deal with in Northern Ireland. And the real reconciliation that needs to take place in Northern Ireland has yet to happen because of the fact that we give a nod to the fact that people who had used political violence could be allowed out of prison without any repercussions at all. So I voted against the Belfast Agreement for that very reason. And I voted against it for other reasons, and accountability of ministers, more technical reasons, which we were able to deal with in the St Andrews Agreement of 2006. But that whole moral piece continues to cause problems for us in Northern Ireland, and I think that's the issue that we really need to grapple with today.
Yes, of course, these are very delicate and traumatic dimensions of Northern Irish history. But you're right in highlighting their importance. So I wonder whether the role of the churches should be part of our conversation now, particularly because the divide coincided largely with the confessional divide between Protestants and Catholics. And to the present day, of course, the two camps have a fairly clear-cut religious identity. But what is the role of the churches and church leaders? Do you feel that ministers and bishops and rectors and others have seen their influence declining as a consequence of the Good Friday Agreement? And what is your personal view on all these matters?
I don't think their influence has declined as a result of the Belfast Agreement. I think it's declined as a result of modernism and secularism coming to Northern Ireland, albeit slightly later than perhaps in mainland GB. And there would still be very much a church-going fraternity, of which I class myself as well, in Northern Ireland, whether that's to Roman Catholic Church or to Protestant Church. And actually, in some of the social issues now, there is a crossover, and it's quite interesting when you see the Catholic Church engaging very much with the DUP, for example, on abortion legislation in a way that you may not have thought possible in the 70s and 80s, because of course then it was very definitely nationalism, Catholic, Protestant, Unionist. I think there's more of a crossover now in terms of issues around those social issues that I've mentioned. And so there is very much a crossover now, and we do have a more open society now. And so when I was MLA and First Minister, I would have engaged with all of the churches in Northern Ireland. I'm not sure a Unionist leader in the 70s would have been as free to do that sort of thing. But I think there's a more cohesive society now in Northern Ireland that allows that to happen.
You say cohesive, but then you say that modernism, or at any rate secularism, have somehow damaged or weakened this cohesion, because the churches are divided themselves, aren't they?
Well, no, I don't think the churches are divided. The churches are very much work together in the Churches Council, which exists, and they work together on a lot of issues. Obviously, they have their own witness, which is separate, but they do work together on a lot of issues. I think now, actually, the battleground is probably what is the role of faith in the public square, as opposed to what's the role of Protestantism or Catholicism. It's more a space of what is the role of faith in the public square, because more and more, reflecting what happens in Great Britain, people in public life are challenged because of their faith, if they have a faith. And I think that's something that's reflected right across the UK.
Are you now thinking of issues of sexual orientation, for example? But they are different. They are interestingly completely different from the sort of issues which in the past used to divide Northern Ireland. How does this affect the role of the churches as peacemakers?
I think the church have a very important role as peacemakers, certainly in terms of issues around poverty, in terms of disadvantage. They very much come together and speak as one on issues such as that. During the COVID period, we would have engaged with the churches as one in relation to how people worship during COVID. I was very proud of the fact that we could do we had a very close relationship with all of the churches, and actually I think we were probably one of the most, I don't want to use the word liberal, but we were the more permissive scheme, I think, in terms of allowing the churches to determine what happened within their churches during COVID. And they were very sensible in working with us on those issues.
I think, just to interrupt briefly, there's an interesting point that Eugenia brings up, which is that we now have a group in Northern Ireland who do not consider themselves part of either of those two religious groups. And maybe that's a consequence of secularism, maybe that's a consequence of younger generations. But what I would ask you is, how was that anticipated back when the Good Friday Agreement was first being thought about? And now that it has come to pass, what does that mean? I know you want to come in on the points, we'll get to that. I'm just curious how you would think back to those times and then to today.
Well, I don't think it was anticipated, but was it anticipated anywhere? I don't think it was, you know. But I think if you are talking about the so-called middle ground parties in terms of the Alliance Party and the Unionist bloc and the Nationalist bloc, I think there is a development there that wasn't foreseen during the Belfast Agreement. And the question is, how do you manage that? How do you deal with that? And I think there probably will be, as there was in 2006 with the St Andrews Agreement, a review at some stage. But a review should only take place when there's stability in the process. And unfortunately, we don't have stability at this moment in time because of what's happening in connection with the Windsor Framework.
We'll get back to that.
Well, yes,
no doubt.
Going back to the issue of trauma and the role of the churches, you're suggesting that there is now a coming together of people of faith, at least, if not against people of non-faith, but at any rate, a coming together of people of faith. This would be probably the first time since 1945 the Catholics and Protestants take a similar position about mourning for those who were killed in the case of the Second World War. And nowadays, are you suggesting that there is a similar sort of shared ground with reference to the violent killings of the 30 years or so of the Troubles?
Yeah, I would like to think that there is a shared ground in relation to that. I think people have different narratives about what happened in the 70s, 80s and 90s, and which is why I think there's a real need for government to have factual information about what happened as opposed to what people think happened in the 70s, 80s and 90s. And I know during the Legacy Bill, my colleague Baron Godson is putting forward a proposal in that respect in terms of the amendments to have an official factual piece as to what happened during the Troubles, and I think that would be very helpful. But in terms of the political parties, there's still a difficulty there because, as you know, Michelle O'Neill said last summer that she felt that there was no alternative to the violence of the 70s, 80s and 90s. I don't accept that. I think there was always an alternative peaceful route as opposed to killing neighbours and killing those who you were opposed to. So there is this mismatch in terms of how we view the past, and that I think is probably one of the omissions of the Belfast Agreement, that we didn't deal with that issue at the time. And look, it was an enormous piece of work, the Belfast Agreement, but I think dealing with the past, dealing with legacy, dealing with victims' feelings and issues has led us to the position where we now are 25 years later, and we're having this legacy bill in Westminster to try and deal with the issues.
Yes, history remains a very contested area, especially in Ireland, and I'm glad that I'm not Irish. And in approaching in approaching Irish history as I do professionally, but going back to the divisiveness of history, what about the persistent confessional divide in the churches, in the schools? The fact that so much of education remains basically denominationally defined.
Yes, that's true. And of course, after partition, the state set up schools, and in a concession to the Catholic Church, they allowed them to set up their own schools. So that was the genesis for having our divided school system in terms of the Catholic system and the state system. Now we have the Irish language sector as well, and we have the integrated sector as well as Christian schools. So we have a range of school sectors in Northern Ireland, and some people will say it's right that we have a choice as to which schools we are able to send our children to. On the other side, we have people who say the whole thing should be just integrated. But as I often say, you wouldn't start from here, but how do we ensure that our young people have a shared experience? And actually, some of the work that has been going on at very local level has been around shared education. So people who go to state schools, people who go to Catholic maintained schools will have shared education together. Maybe they'll go away to an event together. Perhaps they'll have shared classes in one particular subject, whether it's maths or English or whatever, because they're a small school and they need to come together for that. Actually, shared education to me is a very powerful tool, because you maintain your identity, but you're sharing with another identity. Because I think sometimes people believe that the best way to deal with where we are as a society is to make everything bland. I don't agree with that. I actually think you're entitled to have your own identity, but it's important to share with other identities. And in doing so, you're able to decide which is best.
Yes, so I of course agree with what you just said, but in trying to go forward from where you are, let us consider the question of the language, which you just mentioned. Why is this so divisive? After all, it was Protestant clergymen and scholars who somehow revived the language in the 17th century. Yes, the translation of the Bible into the Irish language, which was conducted at Trinity College Dublin. And there are parts of the British Isles where the Gaelic language is closely associated with very conservative Protestantism. So there is not necessarily an intrinsic confessional dimension. There was a Presbyterian Gaelic scholar in the 1930s who ridiculed the idea that the Gaelic is intrinsically Catholic. It is similar, he said, to believing that the Bible is intrinsically Protestant. But the point is, basically, why is it not possible to look at the issue of the language in this broader historical perspective? Thinking, for example, of the Protestant input through the centuries into the reviving of the language, of the Gaelic language in Ireland.
That would be lovely. But we have to live in the real world, Professor. And the real world is that republicanism, aggressive republicanism, have used the Irish language as a tool to, particularly in places in the west of the province, to isolate, if you like, those of us who identify as unionists. And that's the difficulty. I wish it wasn't so, but that is the case. And I think that if we are to move forward, and as you know, we do have this culture bill that has now passed, Culture Act, as it now is through Westminster, that my hope is that it will become depoliticised, because it has been very politicised. And I mean, if you go to Northern Ireland today, we have a local government election in the middle of May. You will see Sinn Féin with Irish language posters, and that is to mark territory, akin to a dog marking territory, which is wrong. If Irish language is to be inclusive, then it should be something that is not politicised and is something that's open to everybody.
What would happen if Protestants came up with the idea then the language, the Gaelic language, is actually a Protestant heritage with similar posters.
Yeah, and I have tried to learn a few words of Gaelic just to disarm people, and so I used to be a councillor in Fermanagh and Omagh Council, and we used to have a lot of Republicans who would use phrases to try again to isolate unionists in the council because they would think that we didn't understand what they were talking about, so they could have a conversation without us being part of that conversation, which to me is bad manners. But because of that, you pick up different words. And I'll tell you a story. I don't know whether any of you remember Katrina Ruan, who was our education minister when I was economy minister at the time. And I was standing in for Peter Robinson in 2010, and there was a lot of hubbub at the executive table, and I just said, Katrina, Sinead, which means, that's it. And she went, the fact that I'd used an Irish language word to communicate with her was quite a shock to her, but she hadn't realised that I had picked up when I was in a council. And I mean, that's the way it should be. People should be able to pick up different words as we do from French and German, but because it's been politicised, a lot of people in the unionist community feel isolated from it, which is a shame.
Do you remember how many unionists were taken aback during the commemoration of the First World War because the Republic claimed this legacy of the song for the first time?
Absolutely, yeah.
Could not something similar be done in reverse for the language by the Protestants?
Yeah, well, as you know, the Church of Ireland, and as you've mentioned, the Presbyterian Church, do have services in Gaeilge in the Republic of Ireland, and I've no doubt that if it was depoliticised within Northern Ireland, that could happen in the future as well. But it has to be depoliticised, because if you use a language for political purposes, then the other political position will feel that they cannot be a part of it, and that's a shame.
I'm going to bring things forward a bit, and actually you've touched on it, which is your experience of devolution as set out by a combination of the Good Friday Agreement and the St Andrews Framework working. Because there is a 10-year stretch between 2007 and 2017 when you have, I think they were famously referred to as the Chuckle Brothers, right?
Even though Ian was only there for a year.
Even though he was only there for a year. You had Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness, and then others going forward. So my question to you is this: when power sharing works, what's it like?
Well, I think for power sharing to work, there has to be mutual respect and understanding that you're not going to agree with everything that your opponent. I mean, mandatory coalition is an incredibly difficult system to work, because essentially you have the DUP right of centre, you have Sinn Féin very much left of centre, the Alliance Party, which probably sees itself as centrist, Ulster Unionist probably right of centre, SDLP left of centre. So you have a real mixture of political philosophies, never mind constitutional philosophies, within the government. So what you have to try and do is find where you agree, what can we agree on to move forward on in education, and there'll be red lines for some socialist parties in education, and likewise for us in terms of the DUP, there'll be red lines. So it's trying to find the middle ground and then move forward. And I know that's not an ideal form of government by any means, but it, as you rightly say, it worked for a period of years when things were quite stable. And during that time, I was the economy minister for most of that time. And the great joy for me was to be able to go out and sell Northern Ireland as a place to do business in. From an educational point of view, we had top students who could then become employees within these companies that could come into Northern Ireland. From a tourism point of view, we had a huge influx of tourists. We put a huge amount of money into tourism infrastructure. So it was a really good time. And so when it worked well, but it was always quite fragile in terms of those relationships within the executive.
I don't want to take up too much more time because I want to get to questions, but I fear we must now come to Brexit. And so the power sharing breaks down in 2017, it breaks down again in 2020, and it breaks down over 2021, I should say, really, and it breaks down over the withdrawal agreement and Boris Johnson's deal. and which has now been adapted by the Windsor Framework. Now, you led, or were part of a team that led a court case against those two, really, I think you would say both reforms. So I suppose I'd ask you to outline the argument of that court case and why you feel that those two agreements should not be legal.
Well, it was more on the protocol, but I don't think the Windsor Framework has dealt with the key point of the Supreme Court judgment, and that's the issue. So the Supreme Court said that the protocol suspended Article 6 of the Act of Union, and Article 6 of the Act of Union is actually the trading piece. In other words, that there would be free, unfettered trade between, as it was at the time, Ireland and Great Britain, and there would be no impediment. And the Supreme Court were very clear that the protocol, being a later act of Parliament, we were arguing that because it was a constitutional act, it should have been impliedly repealing Article 6. That wasn't accepted. But what was said was, because it was a later act of Parliament, that it suspended, for want of a better word, and it was seen as temporary, which was interesting. Article 50 was seen as temporary. And that if there was a later act of Parliament, then that Article 6 could be put back in place. The Windsor Framework doesn't change that, Article 6. I believe that the Prime Minister, if he so chose to do so, could deal with that issue through a later act of Parliament or through some legislation in Parliament. And it will be interesting to see what happens in the coming weeks in terms of the Windsor Framework and the clarification that may or may not be given to try and get devolution back up and running again.
So Article 6, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to speak to the constitutional question, but the purpose of Article 6 was to put an end to over a century of economic policy passed from Westminster that was designed to manipulate the Irish economy so that it would not harm what were perceived as English manufacturing interests. I'm not going to bore everybody to death with the origins of that and the Linen Act of and things like that, but it's all there. But its intention was to preserve and support the Irish economy by bringing it within and by blocking Westminster from discriminating against Ireland. Mm-hmm. We now have a position where Northern Ireland is essentially in two markets. Mm-hmm. So if I could ask you to leave aside the constitutional point for a moment, do you feel that Northern Ireland will be economically better off or worse off than the rest of the UK as the Act currently stands?
Well, I think only time will tell in relation to, we're told by President Biden and others that there will be American investment that will come into Northern Ireland because we're part of the EU single market, whilst at the same time being in the UK customs union. But I think the difficulty, and I mean, I always talk about this from two different levels. So the multinationals and the large companies will have no difficulty dealing with the rules because they will find a way around it or they will find a mechanism to deal with that. My difficulty is Northern Ireland is a small business economy, and a lot of those small businesses rely on a supply chain from the rest of the United Kingdom into Great Britain. I'll give you a very simple example. A lady in North Belfast who made hanging baskets, put flowers in them, whatever. She got the baskets from a supplier in Great Britain. The supplier said that he could no longer supply those to her because of the burden of regulation and paperwork and what have you. She would have to source them somewhere else. She sourced them from the Republic of Ireland and they were 3 times the price. So therefore, she's having to pass that on to her customers. So that's a small business issue, and that has been replicated across Northern Ireland. And therefore, for me, that is the real problem. We don't have free trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland in the fashion that we did, because most Northern Ireland companies had their supply chains back into Great Britain. Now they're having to look for alternative suppliers. That's called diversion of trade, which was supposed to be not allowed in the protocol, but it has happened, and that supply chain is probably more expensive.
Now, at this point, and we're talking about business, yes, you have given very specific examples, but the fact remains that since 2020, Northern Ireland has been the most dynamic part of the United Kingdom economy. And even in the first quarter of 2023, indicated a growth of 1.4%, which is in contrast to the rest of the kingdom, which is only 0.4%. So if this protocol is damaging, can we please have it here as well?
I think Scotland would quite like it.
Also East Anglia, I can tell you, East Anglia could do with that.
Yeah.
And
but I think the important point is, as I've said, global companies will always find a way to deal with these issues, and they will look for more markets, and that's fine. But you have to understand that the Northern Ireland economy, there are a lot of small businesses that are suffering at the moment, and our citizens are suffering as well, because I cannot order something from, for example, if I wanted seeds from Devon for my garden, they have to come through a gardening operation in Northern Ireland. I can't go online and order those in. So there's a middle person involved now. I have to go to a company in Northern Ireland who can then process them through. So I know you might think, oh, that's a small thing. But actually, if you're a British citizen living in Northern Ireland, it's quite a big thing.
it's a great opportunity. You can set up a business.
You're very much a businessman, aren't you?
Well, I hope I will be.
We're going to get to audience questions, but I have one final question, which dates back and comes back to, I was fascinated when I saw the legal challenge go through, and it has the Act of Union emblazoned on the front as this central reason why you're challenging. Of course, Parliament could just repeal the Act of Union and pass something else, and then there would be no legal challenge. So my question is this: according to the logic of what you've thought about and your experiences of Brexit's various over the last 5 years, would unionism be helped by a written constitution?
I have always, from a philosophical point of view, been against a written constitution. I believe in the constitution that has evolved over the years for the whole of the UK. That's something I believe in. I know others feel differently. But when I look at my nearest neighbours in the Republic of Ireland and I look at their constitution, it hasn't really served them well, because it has had to be changed on numerous occasions because society has changed. So when it was written in 1937, Ireland was in a very particular place. It's not in that place anymore, and it has numerous amendments to deal with that issue. Would it not be better to have an evolving constitution, which is what we have here in the UK? And that's what I believe in.
Okay. I'm going to open things up to audience questions, and Jack is going to kindly come with a microphone. Please wait until the microphone arrives before asking your question. Okay. Brendan, I'll let you get things underway.
Thank you very much. A really interesting discussion. I've got two questions. One is to do with nomenclature. So your party, and of course the Ulster Unionists as well, are called a Unionist Party. But in terms of the 19th century categorization, you'd be more, six-county home rulers. So my question would be, wouldn't a more accurate description be, Ulster devolutionists or something like that? It's a provocative question, but I'd be interested to know your answer on that, because it seems to me as if the Stormont Parliament, in a sense, was offered to Ulster Unionists almost without them asking for it. It was a way that the British saw Westminster sort of tidying up the problem earlier in the 20th century. My second question is to do with Prime Minister Sunak's recent remarks, that he said that if Unionists did not accept the Windsor Agreement, there was a risk of a 32-county republic. And I was very surprised by that. That seemed to me almost in the nature of a threat that a UK Prime Minister would say that. And I was wondering how you felt about it and how you interpreted it.
So first of all, I'm not a member of a political party anymore, Brent. I'm a non-affiliated peer. So I left the DUP after my defenestration in 2021. So I don't think they are. Some people might be just interested in Northern Ireland. For me, it's always been about the UK and the United Kingdom, which is why I'm very privileged to be in the House of Lords now, because I can take a wider view, and it's not just about Northern Ireland, it's about Scotland, it's about Wales, it's about England, and it's about the whole of the UK. So that's a personal view of mine, and it has always been that. And actually, when I was a teenager and first getting involved in politics, I was very attracted to equal citizenship campaign that was running at that time back in 86, 87. That was pre-devolution in Scotland and Wales, and then later in Northern Ireland, because it was around that whole piece of us all being the same. And I know people, of course, argue for regional differences, and of course I'm a proud Northern Ireland person. But I was very much attracted to that integrationist argument back in 86, 87. In terms of Rishi's threat, it was a surprise because his ministers were standing up and talking about when people were saying, if you don't have devolution in Northern Ireland, there will be joint authority. His ministers were saying in the Lords and in the other place that that was wrong because the Belfast Agreement was very clear that Northern Ireland was part of the United Kingdom and would remain so until such times as the people of Northern Ireland decided otherwise. So yes, it was a surprise, particularly from someone who claims to be a unionist and who wants to retain the union, not just in Scotland, but in Northern Ireland as well, yeah.
Eugenio, do you want to come in on any of that?
Well, on the issue of the name of the parties.
Sure.
Of course, even before 1920 or 1921, with the Ulster Covenant, the Ulster Unionists effectively set the revolution, the Irish Revolution, going, which was a process which was not unionist. To say the least, they were challenging the authority of the British Parliament. And they were challenging the whole constitutional process.
The Ulster Unionist Council goes back to, I think it's 1905.
But 1912 is when they organized a paramilitary force, which is basically claiming sovereignty in a way which effectively similar to how the American Civil War started. This is not a basic problem with unionism. The level of loyalism is so qualified that it means basically whatever they intend it to mean, but it's not loyalism as British people would understand it. Nobody in Yorkshire would organize a Yorkshire volunteer force.
Perhaps if Yorkshire was being pushed out of the union, they may feel differently about that, Professor.
But I don't think there is any precedent or any parallel.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, as you know, not just people in what is Northern Ireland now, but people in other parts of what is the Republic of Ireland now felt very strongly that they wanted to stay within the United Kingdom. And they felt that they were being betrayed and let down, something which is very familiar to unionists in Northern Ireland. And I'm not saying that I approve of what happened at that time, but it's a point in history. What we need to look at now is the point in history now is that the Belfast Agreement, which has been in place for 25 years, which, as I've said, I didn't vote for, but which was voted upon, which was endorsed by 72% of people in Northern Ireland and an even bigger majority in the Republic of Ireland, says that Northern Ireland will remain part of the United Kingdom until such times as the people of Northern Ireland decide otherwise. And all of the polls are very clear that that is nowhere in the future. You know, it's very clear that that is the case, and despite all of the noise from the Republic of Ireland and from those who would put forward a United Ireland as a solution, that has not been the case that has been accepted in Northern Ireland.
Yes, it is a point in history, but the attitude remains the same.
And
the attitude is basically the Ulster parties, and certainly the Ulster Unionists and the DUP, claim a sort of sovereignty for themselves, which is whatever it is not unionist.
No, I disagree, because I think it's now for the people of Northern Ireland to decide whether they remain within the United Kingdom or not. And if there were to be a referendum, which frankly I hope there won't be for this reason alone, it's not as if I don't think we would win it, we would win it. But under the Belfast Agreement, there's an entitlement then to have a referendum every 7 years, which would be hugely destabilising to people in Northern Ireland. I think it was a mistake to have that in the Belfast Agreement. It's not even a generational point. It's every 7 years, which would then lead to huge destabilization. And all we would do is move from one referendum to the next referendum, and the arguments around all of that.
I'm going to call a halt, but we may get back to this. Okay. Other questions? Yeah.
You've mentioned Scotland a few times there. I wondered if you could say a wee bit about the interconnectedness or not between the kind of Scottish and Irish national and constitutional debates. How much of an interest do you think unionists in Northern Ireland should take in developments across the Irish Sea? So, for example, if Scotland were to go independent, how much of an impact is that going to have on debates around Irish reunification?
I think it would have a huge impact either way. So if the referendum had succeeded in 2014 in Scotland, I think that would have been hugely destabilising to us in Northern Ireland. And we were very pleased to see that it went in that particular way. And so we keep a very keen interest as to what's happening in Scotland, and I'm sure people in Scotland do the same in Northern Ireland, because it's almost like a domino effect. If it happens in Northern Ireland, then that has an impact in Scotland and vice versa. So there is that interconnectedness in terms of the unionist nationalist case that's going on.
Okay. Yes, Claire.
It's not a particularly political question, but I was just thinking about your point about capacity for referenda every 7 years. And I was just wondering what you think the 25-year-old election agents' view of politics now is in Northern Ireland. What's moving 25-year-olds to get involved in politics, particularly at a time maybe where this process isn't working, or the process that was envisaged to work is stalled?
It's a really interesting question, and as the mother of a 23-year-old, I have somewhat of an insight into this. So when I was that age, the constitutional issue was a huge issue, and we were watching the Downing Street declarations and all of those sorts of things, and we really weren't engaged in bigger picture politics. But I think that has completely changed in Northern Ireland now, and I think young people who are getting involved in politics are getting involved. They may be campaigning on climate change, they may be campaigning on childcare issues, they may be campaigning on particular issues for them, and that's what draws them into politics, which is the same right across the UK. And for that, I'm very thankful that there isn't the same focus in terms of what happened when I was growing up. And so normal politics, if I can put it in that fashion, is becoming more of a reality in Northern Ireland, and that's really good, because we didn't have that when I was in the Students' Union at Queen's University back in 1989 and 1990, So it's good that we have that normal politics now, and I think that is the change in politics in Northern Ireland, and something that will continue to happen, I think.
And you would tie that perhaps to the rise of parties like Alliance, or would you say they're separate trends?
No, I think they're separate trends. I think Alliance have benefited from it, but I do think it's separate, because once you have a relative peace, then people start to think about other political issues, as opposed to just thinking about whether people are getting killed or whether we're talking about the Constitution. I think people are and universities and places of learning are talking about other issues and global issues, which of course is very important, and I think that's good.
Okay. Any other questions before we go back? There's yes.
I just want to go back to what Professor Biagini was talking about the origins of unionism and how that sort of led to the mindset. Is it not the case, because as you said about devolution, that the Ulster Unionism and the Covenant springs up, not Ulster Unionism, but the Covenant, as a reaction to a British Parliament's bill to give home rule to Ireland in Dublin, that eventually you end up with home rule effectively, as you said, in Ulster, and you call the Easter Rising an attack on democracy back in 2016 when you didn't go to the commemoration. Is it not true that if Ulster Unionism had accepted the will of the British Parliament in establishing home rule in Dublin, that we wouldn't have had that attack on democracy in the first place? And actually, it's the intransigence of Ulster Unionism that hasn't benefited it in the long run.
Well, no, I don't. I called it an attack on democracy because we were in the middle of World War I. Actually, that's why I called it an attack on democracy, because I think they took advantage of the fact that we were in the middle of a world war in the GPO and what have you, and that's why instead of working towards trying to find solutions We had the GPO and the 1916 rebellion. Don't forget Home Rule started in 1886, am I right? 82, 86? 86. So, goodness, my A-level history teacher will be very cross with me. 86, so this is not something that happened overnight. This was a process. And I think what you're speaking about in terms of the covenant, which was a peaceful covenant, I think it's important to say that, the 1912 covenant, and the fact that so many people registered their distaste for Home Rule wasn't acknowledged by the British government. And instead, they went forward to the Government of Ireland Act, which of course envisaged two parliaments working together. That fell apart with the War of Independence. The professor's going to admit it. That fell apart with the War of Independence, and we know where that ended up. So we ended up with just one parliament under the Crown in Stormont. I wasn't around at that time, so I'm having to deal with the consequences of where we are today. But for me, I am committed, always have been, to finding democratic solutions to the issues. That's why I think the constitutional issues that have been set out in the Belfast Agreement, whilst I voted against it for other reasons, whilst I think that those constitutional positions that have been put forward in the Belfast Agreement are ones that need to be sustained, that it's up to the people of Northern Ireland as to whether they stay within the United Kingdom, which I believe they will, or whether they vote to go into an all-Ireland state.
Yeah, a few points. First of all, you said earlier on, Yorkshire has never been pushed out of the Union and so on. Home Rule was not an attempt to push Ireland out of the Union. The closest parallel, in all possible ways, is the evolution in Scotland. And when Scotland was opted for devolution, there was a minority of Unionists who didn't want it. They did not organize the Scottish volunteer force or defence force or whatever it is to challenge the authority of the British Parliament. They simply accepted the verdict of the majority. In the case of Ireland in 1886 to 1912, the verdict was much clearer, because between 1886 and 1910, a series of elections, 4 or 5 elections, indicated about 80 to 85% of the vote in favour of Home Rule, including in part of Ulster. And then, of course, that is part of the problem why Ulster was partitioned. Let us bear this in mind. Not just Ireland was partitioned. Ulster was partitioned. Cavan, Monaghan, and Donegal were left out. The local unionists were greatly disappointed and continued to complain about it for generations. But going back to the point, so there is this repeated referenda, if you like, elections which were in Ireland primarily about Home Rule, in which there is an 85% of the population voted in favour. Then Home Rule, which is just devolution, is offered. And instead of accepting it, the very day the document was formed, arms were being imported. And not only that, but the document itself was very troubling, including for many Unionists, Protestants in particular, pious people, ministers of the church, for whom threatening rebellion against the king and parliament was simply incompatible with anything the religion taught them.
Didn't seem to cause a problem in 1798 with Wolfe Tone.
But they were modernists. They were secularists.
I'm just saying they had no difficulty importing weapons and importing people from France to fight against the state at that particular point in time. So look, we can go back to different points in our history and point to violence. What I'm saying to you today is that the constitutional position of Northern Ireland is that we're part of the United Kingdom until such times as people in Northern Ireland decide otherwise. There's no suggestion of people taking up arms in terms of the unionist position to do that. Unfortunately, for 30 years, we had people taking up arms to force those of us who are unionists into a united Ireland, which is not a very particularly pleasant place to have lived through. And I'm very happy to say that today's society in Northern Ireland has rejected violence, whether you're a nationalist or a unionist. And there's only a very small minority of people now in Northern Ireland who would use violence for political ends. And I think that is absolute progress and something that we should celebrate.
Can I just follow up on on some of the wider implications of this debate. Do you feel that we talk about history regarding to Ireland enough, or too much, or not enough?
Well, sometimes too much, because we've spent a lot of time tonight talking about what happened in 1912. And if you look across the map of Europe and geopolitics, I mean, you could talk about this in terms of countries evolving in different parts of Europe much more recently than Northern Ireland, but they're seen as states and they're respected as such. So for those of us who live in Northern Ireland, we want to be respected as part of the United Kingdom. We want to be seen as a region of the United Kingdom and respected as such. But of course, knowing our history is very important and trying to understand it from different perspectives. And someone who very much believes in the study of history, I think it is important to have both points of view.
Well, the Centre for Geopolitics will always be in favour of more study of history, of that I am certain. But I do think, we're going to go back to questions, I do think we're getting at something quite interesting, which is that there is a deep tradition in unionism of fear of Westminster doing something against the union that is so embedded in a long history. Do you think that will ever go away?
People used to refer to it as siege mentality, and siege mentality is when we're under attack from all sources, whether that's from the Republic of Ireland or from other parts of GB. And I think siege mentality peaked during the Troubles because we very much felt as if we were on our own and having to suffer what was going on. I do think it's important for those of us in Northern Ireland to look much wider across the Union, and that's what I'm hoping to do with my foundation, the Together UK Foundation, so that we're not just looking at Northern Ireland, we're looking at Scotland, we're looking at the relationships between Scotland and Northern Ireland, we're looking at the relationships between Wales and Northern Ireland and Wales and Scotland. So it's about that whole piece and the benefits of the Union, whether that's in defence, whether that's in economic, cultural, political, social benefits, and having that fuller conversation, which frankly we haven't had over this past number of years.
You've tied up the question I'd like to end this with, but we've got more questions from the audience before we get there. Okay, so, Niamh.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm going to do that annoying thing and offer a couple of comments, if I may, and then ask the Baroness a couple of questions, if that's okay. The conversation's been really interesting, and you mentioned the Irish language. There already have been efforts in Northern Ireland to depoliticise the Irish language. Linda Irvine, who's been working in loyalist communities in East Belfast for a long time, has been talking about its benefits. And Irish language classes are held all throughout the UK, including in this university. And I doubt there would be many members of that class who would be radical Republicans. So it isn't as politicised, perhaps, as might be made out. And I just wonder if there could be a sort of wider conception of it that yourself and those who might have your view would also follow. Colin Eastwood last weekend said if there had been a vote on Northern Ireland status in the UK, then he missed the victory party. And he said that as a joke because I think for the SDLP, the constitutional position of Northern Ireland hasn't actually changed. I know you've talked about the Act of Union and that being the major reason why you think it might have done, but I think a number of political parties in Northern Ireland don't actually think the constitutional position has changed, and the courts have also agreed with that. So I'm just fielding that as an additional view. But my questions for you are quite different, actually. You said you're no longer a member of the DUP, of course, for your defenestration, which was a very memorable moment for everybody, and I think a lot of people really sympathise with what happened to you in the party. So I just wonder, from your point of view, what were the greatest challenges for you working in the DUP, particularly as a woman in the DUP, of which there are very few and have been very few, more recently, but certainly fewer historically. And then secondly, I suppose I want you to reflect on a more challenging question, which has been the DUP's stance over the last number of years to do with Brexit, from the Theresa May government and the decisions that were made when you were First Minister, that might have seen a softer Brexit, no matter what one may have thought of the backstop at the time. And then, of course, shifting on to Johnson, who I think fairly it's fair to say, threw the DUP under a bus. So I just wonder...
It's quite a lot there.
I just wonder, with the benefit of hindsight, if you might reflect on some of the DUP's decisions in that process. Okay, thank you.
I'm going to give you plenty of time, Teresa.
Right, okay. In terms of Brexit, I mean, the DUP have always been, right from its inception, anti-EU, and they didn't agree with, this is well before my time, our membership of the European Union, and so it should be of no surprise to anybody that we would want to come out of the EU. From my own personal point of view, I supported Brexit because I saw it firsthand as economy minister, the regulatory overkill that came from the European Union, the fact that state aid was a complete bar to me helping companies to be innovative and to use their skills. Unfortunately for us, that state aid still remains in terms of the protocol in the Windsor Framework. And the very basic premise of electing people to make the laws that affect you. And of course, that was our difficulty in terms of the EU. So, I mean, it should be of no surprise to anybody, anywhere, that we were always going to take up a pro-Brexit stance. In terms of the Theresa May piece, goodness, I could, maybe I will someday write a book on all of this. It'll take an incredibly long time. But she had a fundamental misunderstanding about the Belfast Agreement, which was perpetuated by the Irish government as well, that the Belfast Agreement meant that there could not be any checks of any nature between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. I am not, before anybody stands up and talks about a hard border, talking about a return to the militarised border that there was in my youth, but I am talking about issues such as digital intelligence, the need to use trusted traders, small business exemptions, essentially alternative arrangements for dealing with the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And don't forget, it's a minuscule amount of trade that goes from Northern Ireland into the Republic of Ireland when you look at the entirety of the single European market. But from a proportionality point of view, that great European premise of proportionality was not applied when it came to the Northern Ireland border in terms of Brexit, and therefore we had the full force of the European Union forced upon us. So it has been incredibly difficult. I don't resile from that. And at that time, I was leading the DUP as a woman, just to go back to your other point. And I suppose my election as DUP leader was somewhat of a surprise, given that I was a woman, I was under 40, and I wasn't under 40 when I became leader, actually that's wrong. I'm not revisiting when I became a minister, I was under 40, no, I was in my mid-40s when I became leader. And I was an Anglican, an Episcopalian. I wasn't from the evangelical wing of the Free Presbyterian Church or any other evangelical church. So it was probably a surprise to people that I was elected into that position. But I always enjoyed very good relationships with the previous two leaders, Dr. Paisley and Peter Robinson. I like to think I got there because of ability as opposed to tokenism. I would like to think that was the case, given that it is the DUP and not another party. And I also feel that Northern Ireland society, as you probably know, is more conservative with a small c than other parts of the UK. And up until then, there hadn't been too many women in the front line of politics. And one of the pleasures I take now when I look at the Northern Ireland political scene is the fact that there are so many women involved in politics now in Northern Ireland, not just in parties where you may expect them to be, in nationalist parties and the Alliance Party, but also in unionist parties as well, actually. And we have some very capable ladies coming forward, putting their points of view across, being resilient, despite the attacks that they continually get on social media. And women of all colour and every creed are attacked on social media. And it's a really important thing to do to support women to get involved in politics. And when I meet women who say to me, I couldn't get involved in politics because of the social media attacks. I couldn't face what you've had to deal with. I tell them that it's so important that they do get involved, because it's important that we have a voice for women right across the political spectrum in Northern Ireland, and that's something I feel very strongly about. It's something I continue to campaign about now that I'm in the House of Lords. When the online safety bill comes and there's an opportunity to have a code of conduct or guidance in relation to violence against women and girls, I will be very strongly supporting that, because it's something I feel very passionately about.
Thank you both so much. I've learned a huge amount this evening, and I think it's been a really valuable and deep conversation. I have a final question for you, which is, we've looked through the past a fair bit in the last hour or so, but when you look ahead to the next 15, 20 years, what would you like the future of unionism to look like?
I would like unionism to be more open. I would like it to be projecting a very positive view of the union. It's one of the reasons why people say to me, when you had the opportunity to just walk away from politics, why didn't you do that? And I say, because I feel very passionately about the union across the UK and the need to be positive about it. And that's what I'll continue to do. So I want unionists to be, despite all of the negativity that's sometimes heaped upon them, and frankly, sometimes brought upon them themselves, I want them to be positive about the union, to talk about the advantages of being in the UK, and to have a devolved administration working in Northern Ireland that can work with the other devolved administrations across the UK.
Baroness Arlene Foster, thank you so much, and thank you, Eugenia.
Thank you.